right, let's start. Welcome everyone to the last session of the Hot Politics Lab meeting of that year of 2021. We're very happy to have today Frederic Hopp here joining us, presenting work. Frederic Hopp is an assistant professor at ASCOR here at the University of Amsterdam. He just defended his PhD yesterday at the University of California in Santa Barbara. So again, congratulations, Frederic, for successfully defending your PhD. He has published widely in some of our best journals, including Journal of Communication and Computers, Human Behavior, Communication Methods and Measures. He will give a talk about morality and in communication and the brain, and I will hand over the floor to you, Frederic.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. And yes, I'm still suffering from some of the celebrations of last night, but I'll do my best to give this talk today. And I slightly changed up the topic a little bit because I figured this was a very interdisciplinary audience in the past. And so I wanted to make this a bit broader. And so really excited to be talking about some of the work that I've been doing mostly over in California over the last 5 years that all relates to how we study morality in media, society, and the brain. And so to jump right into this talk, you might wonder, what is so special about morality, or why do I focus on morality or opposed to really any other concept that one might study? And it turns out that moral intuitions are a really central motivator of human behavior in a variety of contexts, most of them who somehow relate to political communication. So as most of you probably already know, moral intuitions are central to our group formation. So influencing with who we want to keep in our in-group or who we want to keep in our out-group, or generally just who we affiliate with. And on top of that, moral intuitions also have essentially shape just public attitudes, for instance, on vaccination hesitancies or on abortion or on immigration laws. And some recent research also suggests that they are quite centrally relevant for how media is being or produced. When you think about certain political differences in left versus right-wing media, and of course, also on the other hand, how it's being selectively exposed to by audiences. There's also some interesting research that suggests that messages that are morally relevant or morally salient diffuse more wildly through social networks. So William Brady has conducted some interesting work here. It also influences how we are voting. Whether we're voting for a more conservative party or a liberal party is often also a function of our deeply held moral norms and intuitions. Thus, it also matters for our persuasive success. So there's some recent research suggesting that persuasive messages can have a better or more persuasive effect if they are framed in moral terms that just resonate with the moral norms of the audience. And also, once we start to moralize our attitudes, we start to see things more in these sort of black and white schema, and quickly become a sort of more or less radicalized, that we're not so open towards new opinions of others. Thus, unfortunately, also having a strong cause for violent protests and many other behaviors. So this is just to give you a quick overview of all of the different areas that morality or moral intuitions tap into. And now, while morality is a very vague, maybe, concept, and a lot of people might understand different things about it, moral foundations theory has been a very pragmatic, useful approach to conceptualize what these moral intuitions consist of. And so EMFD has identified 5 moral foundations. So here, for instance, a notion of care and harm or fairness and cheating, and these have often been described as these so-called individualizing foundations. They often occur in notions about, for example, about abortion. And on the other hand, there are these so-called binding foundations that consist of loyalty and betrayal, authority versus subversion, and purity versus desecration. And generally, it's also been found that Democrats tend to value these individualizing foundations a bit more, and conservatives to value these binding foundations somewhat more. And now, conceptualizing morality in such a way, my research mostly tries to understand how do these moral foundations permeate media, society, and the human brain. And so, for instance, on the media level, a central question that I've been asking in the past is, how can we validly extract moral foundations from media content? And if we can do that reliably, then also perhaps, what are some of the societal effects of moralized public discourse, right? So this relates then, how do morally relevant messages permeate society, change attitudes, motivate behaviors? And of course, the central part that connects these two is where and how is morality encoded in the human brain? And how does that relate to our perception of moralized messages and also our behaviors? And a lot of these relationships have been conceptualized and defined in the model of intuitive morality or exemplars, or the MIME. So this has been a very central theoretical framework for a lot of my research. So starting with the first question, how can we validly extract moral foundations from media content? And here there are quite a few challenges that we have to sort of keep in mind if we want to do this type of research. First, as most of you might know, morality is a very latent and highly context-dependent phenomenon. So what might be considered morally good in one context might be considered highly immoral in another context. The majority of moral judgments also occur rather fast and intuitively. They reflect more often these gut level type reaction and not necessarily these more rational, deeply thought about considerations. And third, individuals also quite differ in what they deem morally relevant in one context and not in the other. And when we, so for instance, just your socialization or in what type of cultural context you're growing up very often shapes the moral norms that you hold deeply or that you value strongly. And with all of this in mind, this makes the reliable and valid extraction or detection of moral content in media quite challenging. So one very sort of popular approach in the past is to just rely on some manually selected word lists that hopefully denote some notion of what's morally good or bad. And already just considering that individuals across different cultures differ in their moral sensibilities, selecting just one small list of words might not be that valid or reliable. Furthermore, this also really puts a challenge on the traditional content analysis logic, where we assume that our message that we're analyzing has one true solution, or that there's a crown truth of what the moral content of that message should be. And if morality is latent and people differ in their sensibilities, that might not be necessarily true. Which also complicates just coder training in this regard. And in fact, over 5 studies that we've conducted, we noticed that if you try to develop or apply these really extensive coder trainings, that does not necessarily increase your intercoder reliabilities for measuring moral content. And so here we actually also found that considering this disagreement among coders as noise is not really helpful, because very often we have to flip this around and basically try to predict these reliabilities through people's individual differences in their moral sensitivities. So the solutions that we came up with that we found to produce the most valid and reliable content codings were actually to rely on an appropriately trained crowd in combination with a context-aware annotation tool. So that is a bit more intuitive, that taps into these more intuitions. And so here we recruited a crowd of around 850 people and just asked them to highlight news articles using this annotation tool for what they understand to be related to a particular foundation that we randomly assigned to them. And so this generated around 64,000 highlights, and that procedure yielded the highest, most reliable intercoder correlations. And so now you might say, well, okay, Freddie, this is all nice and good. So does that mean every time we want to code moral content, we have to pay for an expensive crowd that takes a long time and so forth? And so I tried to come up with a way that maintains some of these benefits of this crowdsourced content codings, that while also making this scalable. And so here I developed the extended moral foundations dictionary. So based on these highlightings that were produced by this crowd, I basically start to extract all of these highlights, each consisting with or each one is linked to a specific foundation. I do some basic pre-processing on these highlights, like throwing out stop words, and then basically just linking all of the remaining words with the foundations with which these were annotated. And then the innovation here was that we do not just assign one word to one moral foundation, but rather we calculate the probability that one of these words is associated with a certain foundation. And we did that by looking at how often was a word seen by this coder divided by the total number of times this word was actually highlighted by that coder. So this gives you, for each word, a range of probabilities that this word is associated with multiple foundations. Then we do some basic thresholding to just throw out words that have overall a very low probability and combine them in one final dictionary. We found, for instance, right here, just to give you some face validity of this dictionary, words that received very high probability for care, where, for example, compassion or committing or welcomed, whereas words that had a higher probability in the harm foundation, where it's just tortured, cruel, and this face validity extends towards the other foundations as well. But then we also wanted to see, does this dictionary improve the predictive validity over previous moral foundations dictionaries? And so here, indeed, we found a fourfold increase in the explained variance of news article share counts based on foundation scores derived from the EMFD over previous moral foundations dictionaries. And the Sanctity Foundation turned out to be an especially strong predictor of share counts. And if I have convinced you that this is a good software and you're more curious to apply this for your own text scoring, I encourage you to check out our EMFD score software, which is open source and hopefully well documented to extract more content from text messages. So after hopefully solving, or at least addressing some of these earlier limitations, I then wanted to know, how can we capture these dynamic transactions that might exist between morally relevant messages on the one hand and socio-political events on the other hand? So the central aims of this type of research were, can we capture dynamic transactions between morally relevant news coverage and socio-political events? And if this is possible, can we learn the statistical dependency between moral news frames and real-world events to then forecast future news event careers? So let me conceptualize this a little bit more. Say there is a protest happening somewhere in the United States, and after this protest, there is some news framing about this protest. Some news agencies are covering that event. Now, this is not terribly surprising. This is how news coverage works. But what's a little less intuitive and also, I think, quite fascinating is that through this process of frame setting, so through framing these events in a certain way, this might actually lead to new events. We could say to new or subsequent protesting, which then again are being covered by the news, creating these dynamic transactions. And since each of these events has a time code, we can think of that as a sequence of events in news. And so I was then curious, are there some statistical dependency between how these events are morally framed and how that leads to the onset of future events? So is this possible to capture this relationship and then, based on the previous framing of these events, to predict novel events in the future? So to address this question, we of course had to collect large amounts of event and news data. And so here we relied on the global database of events, language, and tone, or GDELT, for which we developed an user-friendly interface called Interface for Communication Research, or ICOR, and pulled around 3.5 million US-based news articles, so that were published by US news sources between January 1st, 2016 and September 30, 2018. And then to derive the moral framing of these articles, we used the Moral Foundations Dictionary and assigned each article with a moral frame based on the category that had the highest word counts there. And so linking that to some of the events that were mentioned in these news articles, you could, for example, just again for some face validity, see that events that discussed fighting were highest in harm, for example, or events that discussed providing aid were higher in care. And all of these event types were automatically derived from this news article using the Cameo code system. Here you can ask me some more in the Q&A subsequently. But in total, we detected around 500,000 unique events in the United States. And you can see that spikes in here protest events did indeed respond to events that were happening at that point in time. And to then capture a statistical relationship among these news event sequences, we used a hidden Markov model. So first, we created a sequence, as I explained earlier, between events on the one hand and the framing of these events on the other hand. And then we fed this event frame sequence into an HMM that basically just learns which combinations of news and events or news frames and events are more likely to co-occur together within a certain state. Yeah, so you can think of maybe one state as peaceful. So here we have perhaps some discussions of maybe foreign aid being given to another state that are surrounded by frames of care, whereas we might be in another state in society where we see more protest events that are covered with harm frames. But the really important thing here is that the model then learns which frames and events co-occur in these states. So when we zoom in on one of these states, we could see, okay, some of these events are covered more often by particular types of moral frames. And then when we are in a given state, based on the events and frames that we've seen in the past, we try to make a prediction, what are the next events and frames that we're likely to see? And so here we just found for predicting events that have to do with material conflict, our HMM actually had a pretty good accuracy. So it correctly predicted the trend of whether there would be more or less material conflict events at a certain location with around 70% accuracy. So I just thought that this is that was quite encouraging, and also points to these HMMs as a potential moral conflict early warning system. And of course, in future iterations of this work, we want to apply a more rigorous capturing of news events and moral news frames. So finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about what we've learned about where and how morality is encoded in the human brain. This was a lot of work that I've done during my dissertation. And so the first question here that we addressed is, how can we map where in the human brain moral judgment is happening? And so for that purpose, we recruited a sample of 64 participants that was roughly split into 1/3 as participants that identified as Democrats, 1/3 that identified as Republicans, and 1/3 that identified as either independent or unsure. So we had a good variance in political affiliation here. And then these people underwent an fMRI experiment that consisted of 3 runs. And in these runs, people responded to these moral foundation vignettes. And so you can think of a vignette just as a short textual description of a moral violation. So for instance, you see a man leaving his family business to go work for their main competitor, a violation of in-group or loyalty. And then they had to rate, is this morally wrong or not? And they did that for a bunch of moral foundations versus social norm as a control group condition. And just on the behavioral level, we already see indeed people judge vignettes pertaining to moral violations as more morally wrong compared to violations of the social norm category. So we took that as some evidence that indeed there was some difference in moral judgments of these categories. And when looking at the brain, we did a standard general linear model. I'm not sure how familiar you are with fMRI. I'm happy to explain here more in the Q&A, but we found a reliable dissociable brain network that responds to each of these moral foundations versus social norm control categories. So we see these regions such as the precuneus, or also the temporal parietal junction and the medial prefrontal cortex. So common regions that were identified in the theory of mind network. So whenever we're trying to mentalize with others to identify what is an intention of an act. And we took this just as a good confirmation for identifying where are moral foundations or violations thereof encoded in the brain. And we also found, using what's called a searchlight approach, that so basically to interpret this map right here, all of these sort of little clusters and points show that at these locations, a computer classifier that was trained on these neural patterns was able to figure out, is this person right now evaluating a moral foundation that's related to harm or to fairness or to cheating? So it makes a prediction of what is the current moral violation this person is processing. So it shows where in the brain, or where the brain does make a distinction between these different moral categories. And finally, in the interest of time, I'm just going to skip one slide ahead. I wanted to then know, does political ideology actually modulate the processing of political messages? And so here, the same subject as before watched 22 political attack advertisements while being in the scanner, 11 attacking Clinton and 11 attacking Trump. And then I just computed how similar are subjects in their political ideology, so just measured between liberal and conservative. And then I also did the same matrix to measure how similar are these participants in their neural response. And then using a technique called ISRSA, I just looked at how good does this individual similarity in political ideology matrix fit the matrix of similarity in neural responses. So we can measure this coherence with Spearman's rho. And indeed, I found that people of a more similar political ideology had more similar neural responses, which I think is some very interesting early evidence that political polarization might already happen at the neural level. Now, to conclude this talk, I hope that this research demonstrates that morality indeed permeates and shapes human communication at multiple and interconnected levels. And so I think that going forward to really understand how people create, process, and respond to moralized communication requires an interdisciplinary effort where I think communication scholars, political scientists, and psychologists can do some very, very promising future research. And talking about that, some of the things I'm currently looking into is using some more advanced deep learning and context-aware moral sentiment mining techniques that don't rely on dictionaries, but that are able to really capture the entire context in which moral words are named. And as I already mentioned earlier, I'm really interested in further exploring these neural models of political polarization processes. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. Here's a picture of me tinkering with the MRI scanner with hopefully clean socks on. And yeah, if you're curious in this work, please either follow me on Twitter or shoot me an email. And for now, I look forward to any questions that you have. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Freddie, so much. This was a very, very interesting presentation, covering like so many different levels from the social level to the very deep individual neural level. So this is fantastic line of work, at least for me. I also work a little bit with political neuroscience and how people respond to similar messages, perhaps. So I'm particularly interested and fascinated by your talk. Before we go about any questions that people online could also post on the Q&A box, I'd like to give the floor for any clarification questions to the people who are here. I think that Christian had one already.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the talk. It was super fascinating. About the part of your presentation about your event study, I didn't really get exactly what you did there. Can you clarify a bit, what's an event here?
Yeah.
And do you actually predict an event happening, or do you predict an event being covered in a specific moral frame? And what's the mechanism then that relates the coverage with a moral frame at time X, how does that relate to the coverage at time X in the future?
And perhaps if I may add like one sub question to this, what were specific like issues that you were interested in defining as events, for instance, like economic events or protests solely? So what was your focus on and why?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me just maybe go back to this slide. So perhaps let me start by answering the first question, what is an event here, right? So based on these 3.5 million news articles that we pulled, in this GDELT database, they have an automated event detection system, which is working in a way that it looks at subject, verb, object pairs to then identify different event categories. Those include protest events, those include when someone is making a speech or when there is a meeting between political elites. This is all automatically extracted and grouped into certain categories. So for example, the timeline that I'm showing you here are articles that mention protest events. And so these spikes in protests did indeed correspond to protests that were happening at the real world during that time. So does this address the first part of the question, like what is an event here?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Okay, cool. And then the second question, if I remember correctly, is what am I actually predicting? So what I'm predicting is with the nice thing with these hidden Markov models is because they learn both. So they learn which news frames and which events appear together. So you can think about that maybe broken down more in a simpler case. Think about the different seasons of a year, right? So where we have summer, fall, winter, spring. And so during these seasons, you're more likely to observe certain things, colder temperatures in winter and warmer clothes, right? And so you could either predict the temperature or perhaps what people are wearing. And so in a same context here with these hidden Markov models, we are able to either say, we would like to now predict events or frames. And so what this model is really then doing is it says, based on the sequence that I just observed, what are the next events that I'm likely to see in the future? And so what I'm predicting here specifically is I've not predicted one specific event type. So I'm not saying I predict a protest, but I've grouped together events of a similar kind. So there are different sort of sub-definitions of protests. So I'm grouping these together, and what I'm predicting really is the density, so the general trend in these forecasts. So are we more likely to observe more protests or less protests in the future? Does that clarify things a little?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Cool.
I see that Heis has raised his hand, so perhaps Heis has a clarification question or another type of question.
Thanks, Johannes, and thanks, Freddie, for the very interesting presentation. It's really nice how I have how many moral foundations are there? I think original theory we had 5. In one of your figures I saw only 4. But what also concerns me a bit is that, I've seen some research and I've done some research on my own regarding moral foundations, and typically people don't actually retrieve these 4 or 5 dimensions. So I'm interested to hear your perspective on that.
So I mean, just first to be absolutely clear, I absolutely share, and I'm not saying that moral foundations theory is the only and the best theory to explain or to describe human morality or human moral judgment. There have been recent theories such as the morality as cooperation theory developed by Oliver Curry and colleagues that take a quite different approach to it. The reason why I've used MFT in the past is really just because it was very pragmatic to address the questions that I was interested in, and that it provides this space of moral foundations. And one of the things I also found in the past is indeed, if I can just go back here, when we just look at the factor structure in questionnaires or really in measuring text, is very often, I mean, MFT predicts a 5-factor model to looking at these 5 foundations, but very often you get a much better fit if you only predict 2 categories. And that will fall into these individualizing versus binding foundations. So this is, I guess, one valid criticism of EMFD. And the other question concerning how many moral foundations there actually are. I mean, John Hyde and colleagues, when they kind of created it, they said, well, right now we identified 5, there might be 6 or 7 or 8 or even more. So for instance, with the moral foundation vignettes that we looked at, there is this 6th category, oppression, which has not been covered originally, but this one is, at least in the activity patterns and also in how people respond to it, very, very similar to the fairness cheating foundation. So that one has quite some overlap with it as well. Yeah. But what I'm currently after, and what I think speaks actually for EMFD, is when we look at the brain, and specifically when we look at these classification results, I mean, just to maybe elucidate that one more time, the computer here is being given a range of brain activity patterns. Each pattern corresponds to one mole foundation. And then on a holdout set, I'm asking to predict the foundation that this person is currently processing. So if they all had exactly the same pattern, we could not discriminate that. And so since we have 7 different categories, the chance classification would be around 14%. And at these sort of peak areas where we sometimes even see 22% accuracy, now this is not a lot more, very latent, higher order valid evidence for the at least dissociable structure of these norms. Now, apologies, that was a long answer to the question, but hopefully things are a bit clearer now.
Thank you, Freddie. Unfortunately, we also have some problems with the Wi-Fi here, so we heard partially your answer, but I think we got most of the gist of it.
Okay.
So thank you for that. Are there other questions from people who are like in the room here? And perhaps I could also take the liberty and ask you a question. Actually, I'm interested in how you like selected these brain regions that you looked at. So did you follow like a traditional like a Roy's like approach? And if yes, then how were these Roy's defined beforehand? And I wonder like whether you would see any like added value if you had followed like a convolutional networks approach instead, whereby you could just leave the data practically speak on its own without having certain priors about where in the brain you might have these, you would expect activity differences. So I wonder what's your ideas about
right.
Where in the brain we should look at for morality.
Yeah, absolutely. So the results that you see here was just a very standard whole brain analysis, so not a priori. So this was corrected for multiple comparisons, and then I made a contrast categories. So this was not done a priori, but I do think what is really promising here is when you, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Neurosynth, the meta-analytic database that exists. And so if you go to Neurosynth, I will show you regions that are consistently activated whenever people study moral judgment. You get a very, very similar pattern. And in fact, if I were to do this on a priori or just Roy basis, I would have also selected again the precunious, particularly also the RTPJ and the DMPFC, as they've just been shown to be very consistently activated when people engage in moral decision making.
Yeah, so again, unfortunately, we only heard like fragments of your answer. So that's a pity. I did get the Neurosynth sentence So I'll dive a little bit more into that because I'm not very familiar with it. So thank you for this information. And I also have another question that is perhaps a little bit more general. So that relates to the brain networks that we typically, we might be interested in finding out like structural differences in the brain or like network differences in the brain that correspond like to ideology or at least moral, the moral foundations as in your studies in line of work. I'm interested about the relation between, or whether you see any relation between, the confidence we have in this data and the fact that this data is often very highly biased from sleep patterns, individual differences in sleep patterns. So I've been coming across lines of work lately that seem to suggest that individuals who sleep differently seem to develop very different neural activation patterns over the same stimulus, regardless of any other like fundamental factors, including political ideology in this case. So I wonder whether you controlled for like sleep deprivation in your studies, whether you think that that might be relevant, and if yes, where do you see this connection coming from? So there is some line of work showing that, for instance, conservatives tend to consume more media content late at night, and perhaps that might be, the connecting bridge to why these people are more sensitive to processing fear, for example. So I just wonder whether you have some thoughts about that and whether you have control for this variable in your studies.
Yeah, that's super interesting. This is actually the first time I heard someone linking sleep deprivation to political ideology. So I really, really appreciate you making that comment. Of course, that also addresses the questions. So I've not looked into how individual differences in sleep deprivation modulate that. I don't even think we have that data. So the data was collected in 2016 in the summer, so right before the presidential election in the US. And I mean, I controlled for all the typical individual differences where that you get with cerebral spinal fluid and scanner drift and all of that. But I do have media exposure variables for each individual, and so here I might be able to see, do we see that conservatives actually watch media more during late at night, and whether that leads to certain sleep deprivation outcomes. But thank you so much. I'll definitely look into that in the future. Yeah.
I'd be more than happy to talk more over a cup of coffee or beer.
Yeah, absolutely.
When conditions allow, of course, and meet you in person. Absolutely. Thank you so much. Are there any other questions in the chat box? I can see that there is one at least, so just give me a sec to read it out loud for you. So we have a question from Matthijs Rodan. Thanks, Frederic. Fantastic research. Unfortunately, I had to miss part of the presentation, so please forgive me if I ask a question that you already elaborated upon. It's two sub-questions practically. Number one, on the side of event types, what is the difference between appeal and provide aid? They look very similar in terms of average number of keywords. And the second sub-question is, could you say a bit more about the neural models of political polarization processes you mentioned in the last slide? Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Matthijs, for the questions. So to just respond to the first question, I encourage you to look up the Cameo codebook. So it's CAMEO, Cameo, which I think stands for Conflict and Mediation Event Observation. And there you get a really nice sort of taxonomy on what the exact definitions of all of these different event types are. I don't know them from the top of my head right now, but those should give you a clearer distinction on what separates them. And so for the second answer, on these models. So the technique here that I'm using is called intersubject representational similarity analyses, or ISRSA, that was developed by Emily Finn and colleagues. And what this method really tries to answer or taps into is, do individuals that have certain similarities in their traits or maybe in their behavior also exert similar neural responses? So this is the very basic question that you want to answer with this model. And so here I again constructed a matrix that just captures pairwise similarity between political ideology. So I mean, This is just a placeholder, but you can think of then you see a certain individual, so pairs are more similar in their political ideology. They fall, maybe they're very close on conservatism and others are more close on the liberal side. So this is your trait matrix. And then I just looked at when people were processing these political attack advertisements, I get a time course for every region of the brain. And then I can look at, for example, right here, I can look at in the precuneus, how similar is this time course for all of these individuals. And then in a final step, you can, for every brain region, you can relate how close does the rank of subjects in these matrices match between the traits and the neural similarities. So for every region of the brain, you get one of these Spearman row values. And so what I'm plotting down here is then for the entire brain, how good is the coherence between traits and neural processing? And since this region is shifted quite to the right, on the whole brain level, you see there is some coherence, meaning people with a more similar political ideology are also processing things in a more similar way. And this was specifically true for these moral brain networks, including DMPFC and TPJ. Now, one super quick addition to that is another way we could test this is we could just group individuals in Democrats and Republicans, and then within each group, look at their similarity in neural responses, and then compare, well, where does this similarity differ from within the same ideology to the group of a different ideology? Van Baar and colleagues, I think they just had a recent PNAS paper where they applied such an approach. So hopefully that taps a bit more into your second question.
I think it does. Thank you. This is very informative also for the newest methods that you suggest. There is another question, this time from Isabella de Basso. She's also a PhD student here at the Politics Lab. Thanks a lot for your talk. I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about the last slide of difference between Democrats and Republicans. Are these different patterns you find a result of Democrats and Republicans processing moral transgressions differently, or of differences in processing of information based on whether participants in party versus my out party being attacked? That means
right. Fantastic question. Thanks, Isabella. So what I'm showing you right here is actually not differentiating between whether it was an anti-Trump or an anti-Clinton ad. So this is for the entire range, and it's just showing you political ideology does modulate it. But in my dissertation, I actually ran this model, and I saw that we have closer processing of when your own candidate is being attacked. So whenever Democrats are processing clips attacking Clinton, there are more similar in their response compared to when Republicans process clips of anti-Trump. So when it's your own group that's being attacked, people become more similar, which I found quite interesting. Yeah, but that's an excellent question. And again, this is very preliminary. This is right off the bat of my dissertation, and I'm really just starting to dive deeper and explore this model in greater depth. Yeah.
Thanks. That's very interesting finding. I'm very curious to tackle this further and see where this goes. Okay, so there is one more question I see from Heis, who has raised his hand. Heis, shall we pass the floor to you?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to write in the Q&A box, but I'm not allowed. So I've been thinking for a while about political ideology, and being originally trained as a political scientist, we have quite a different understanding of what ideology is or how we should measure it than what is typical in neuroscience or in psychology. And I think I don't really have a very specific question. That's why I should have written it down. But in political science, it's common to think about political systems as sort of there are multiple ideological cleavages. And so a typical party system is characterized by 2 or 3 major cleavages, and the US system is uniquely unidimensional. Yep. And so I wonder how this maps onto moral foundations, and maybe more fundamentally, what is really the definition of ideology, if it is something that has to do with fundamental belief systems, then is our moral foundations just not the same as ideology?
Yeah. I think there were also some really interesting papers that try to explain the relationship, what predicts what better. Is it your political ideology predicting your moral foundations, or is it that moral foundations predict ideology? So I think that's still a can of worms that we have to sort of open at some point. But one thing also right here, of course, I totally understand. I just took a continuous measure, on sort of from 0 to 100. If you're 100, you're very strong conservative. If you're a 0, you're a very strong liberal. So I do see that this is a very, especially for political scientists, not very sort of in-depth measure. However, we do have a bunch of additional other measures that might get into this a little bit better. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Society Works Best scale that kind of tries to see the society works better if wealth is distributed or in the hands of a few. And so that gets a little bit more into a multidimensional, I think, measurement or of political ideology that might be a little bit closer to the real world. So yeah, going forward, I think I'd love to have a few more conversations with you on how we can get a better index of political ideology here. And yeah, given this was a US based sample, the degree to which this generalizes to others, societies, nations is also still work to be done.
If I might just give a suggestion, I think also that I think in the end the American data is likely to be as dimensional as the European data. It's just that we focus so much on these 2 parties, right? But within the parties, there's huge variation between Republican evangelicals and the more classical, more secular, and we kind of, we seem to kind of ignore that stuff.
Yeah, which is why I think for this specific analysis, I did not group people into different parties, specifically because I looked at scatter plots before, and I did see that there were 2 Democrats that were super conservative. Yeah, and so I think this more continuous measure might at least get at that a little bit. Yeah.
If I may perhaps take advantage of the few minutes that we have left to sort of broaden up a little bit and reflect a little bit more on this last question on ideology. So I'd be very interested on your personal take on the extent to which ideology could be a hardwired thing. And perhaps, this is a wild question given your line of work, but how about morality? So would you, you show that there exist some structural differences in the brain, right? Like with morality, would you anticipate that these are hardwired systems that we're born with? Or would you see those as systems that we adapt to, and ideology being something as a sort of acceptation, a biological acceptation of these systems? It's a little bit more philosophical question, but I think it's a nice way to finish this wonderful talk today.
I think this is an excellent question, and it really gets into the nature versus nurture discussion, right? And so I again think that EMFD is very strong in here, and that it says that, well, we might be born with these cognitive modules, similar to language understanding, that we have these networks in our brain that will allow us to learn a certain language later on, but it does not restrict us to one language only. And so if we adapt that to our moral values, I think there's been some really beautiful work showing that historical pathogen prevalence in a country nicely predicts the endorsement of the more binding in-group foundations. So in nations that suffered more strongly from a more stronger historical pathogen prevalence, people try to stay a bit closer in the in-group. They're typically a bit more xenophobic. And so I think that shows that there is this variance that we see based on where people do grow up and the cultural socialization that they experience. So I think that leaves this actually open to both, that we might be born with these foundations, but then the type of buildings that emerge based on these foundations might depend on our experience of our daily life.
That's great. Thank you so much. This was a very nice and concise reflection on a very complex topic. I really appreciate your opinion.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I mean, this was super fun, and I really hope that in the future, early coming year, we can all get a coffee or a beer and chat more about these things. I hope there's definitely plenty of shared interests. So great.
It feels like this, absolutely. Thank you so much. And with this and that, I think we only have a few minutes left, and I'll pass the floor back to Christian, who's going to tell us a little bit about the future speakers for 2022.
Yeah,
Christian, back to you.
Thanks again a lot, Frederic. That was a fascinating talk and very interesting to talk to you here. Thanks again. We will of course hand you over the by now infamous hot politics lab coffee mug that is perfectly suitable to have hot coffee in there. We will hand it over to you, of course, when we meet back on campus here. If Omicron at some point allows us to do that, right? And if you're still here then. As I said, this was the last meeting of the Politics Lab for this year. We will go into our Christmas and New Year's break. I hope you guys all do that as well. We will return back strongly in January with a lot of very interesting talks. We have a very interesting lineup that is already mostly published online, so you can already have a look. Just a little outlook, what is waiting for you. We start again on January 14th with Marta Otten, who will give a talk about how political convictions can change basic cognition. And we will then have a couple of different talks. 28th of January, Israel Weizmann Manor. Mano will give a talk about from corruption to cyberspace. 18th of February, we have Graduate Friday again, where Michael Holman will give a talk and Chiara Vialli will give a talk. And the beginning of March, 4th of March, we have Matthias Rodein, who will tell us about an experiment that involves theaters and having 7,000 people as participants in this experiment. So that sounds very interesting and cool. So we're very looking forward to that. That's from us. Again, have a nice break and see you again in January.